My name is Lalit Choda. I'm the founder of the Non-Human Identity Management Group. And today I'm going to be talking to you about humans and now agents, the NHI internal threat amplified. Some of you may have attended our Non-Human and AI Identity Summit on Monday. We also had the Non-Human and Identity Pavilion that we hosted throughout the week. Just in terms of my background, I founded the Non-Human Identity Management Group just over 2 years ago to educate and evangelize about non-human identities, and now, of course, AI agents. Prior to that, I was 30 years in investment banking, working on global large IM, PAM, and NHI programs. One thing I'd like to thank the event organizers for scheduling this session just after the England game. Really happy that we won 4-2. Sorry if anyone's a Croatia fan. Okay, so look, what are we going to talk about? Look, I'm going to talk to you about kind of the internal threat that we don't usually talk about, with this topic. A lot of focus is around sort of the external threats, the hackers, but really, what I'm going to share with you today is really some insights that hopefully will make you really think about, what's coming from an internal threat standpoint that really you should be concerned about. I'm going to tell 3 key stories. One, well, I actually did a talk last year on a practitioner's guide to managing NHI risks. So I'm going to repeat that overview of like something that occurred about 5-6 years ago in a financial institution where one NHI was misused and it started a large NHI program. I'm then going to sort of, fast forward to sort of current time, and sort of now we're into sort of the AI world, the agentic AI world, and what that means now from a threat standpoint. I'm going to then also share another real life example that I personally was exposed to myself playing with Claude. I'll then also talk about kind of a major incident that's occurred that probably everybody is aware of. And through that, you'll hopefully start to see why thinking about the internal threat, is critical, and I would say probably more important than the external threat that's out there. Okay, so let's start with a real life example. When I was working in an investment bank over 10 years ago, I'd been telling my CISO and head of IM that, look, we need to tackle the non-human identity problem. But at the time, management said, look, we need to focus on our IM capabilities. We need to solve our PAM problem. That's what our regulators are after, going after us. But I said, look, your bigger risk is with non-human identities. Then I get a call from my CISO and head of IM saying, look, Lalit, we've had a major business impacting incident occur. We think someone misused a non-human identity. We need you to help us and troubleshoot what happened and cycle the credential that was used and mitigate the risk. As I start speaking to the application team, it turns out that there was an IT person using a database credential for one of the business apps. They were actually trying to connect into UAT. They knew the credentials, the password for this non-human identity. They were running some updates on what they thought was UAT, but connected to production by mistake. So look, 2 key control issues from that that we clearly identified. One, human misuse of a non-human identity, right? People should be using their own identities or their PAM credentials, never use kind of NHIs. The other big issue in that scenario was there was a lack of environment segregation. The same identity, credential, password was used in prod and non-prod. Even though there were 2 separate accounts, they both shared the same password. So that allowed the accident to occur. So then we start thinking about how we're going to fix this issue. So I start speaking to the application team and said, look, you need to cycle this password. They said, look, we can't do that. We don't know how to do that. We don't know even where these credentials are. They're hard-coded in our source code. So I said, look, we need to then, quickly mitigate this risk. There was no scanning in place within this organization. We didn't even have a vault solution. So we then had to sort of put in place some custom scanning capabilities. And then as I'm chatting to the application team, they said, look, by the way, we actually think, the credential that is used by our business app, along the years, we may have given it to other teams as well. So that's an even bigger challenge for us to now sort of dissect. So the next thing we do is we work with our DBAs and we turn on monitoring, logging, across the specific database that was compromised. And after a few days, we kind of uncovered through, who was connecting in, the IP addresses, that it was about another 8 applications that were using the same underlying credential. So we then have to talk to the other teams and talk to them about, effectively moving away from this shared credential, start creating their own new credential, and then secure that as well. Again, those teams had hard-coded credentials. They didn't know where everything was sitting. So before you could even cycle the password, we would need to scan all the source code. So I'm sure this sort of situation is maybe hopefully familiar to you. Maybe if you're still on your NHI journey, this is something that is going to be critical, right? To discover, scan, and understand, where you've got hard-coded secrets. So in the end, I'll sort of fast forward. Our CTO said, look, we need to fix this in 24 hours. 24 hours became 3 weeks, right? It just was that long to kind of find all the dependencies, create new credentials. Then you'd have to change all the places where these credentials were in source code across all the different applications. And that was literally many, many man weeks of effort across many teams to coordinate. So what else kind of was there from a control issue that we uncovered? Clearly, we talked about hard-coded credentials, sharing of credentials. We clearly had no monitoring controls as well in place around humans using these non-human identities. And the final kicker was our policy standard said you don't need to cycle non-human identities if it's 15 characters and it's complex. So none of our NHIs were ever cycled. So look, then after that incident, it was a chaotic, very stressful situation because it caused a huge amount of business impact. My CISO and head of IM said, look, Lalit, we now need to sort of work on what you've talked about for the last few years. We need to start a huge NHI program. And that was something I then ran for 4 years at this huge investment bank. We had to build all the capabilities from the ground up on how to manage, discover, secure the NHIs. We fixed over 100,000 credentials, secured them, cycled them. We scanned over 1 million hard-coded credentials in our source code. This was a very large global investment bank. So look, that's a case of a human, accidentally causing huge business impact. So I'm now going to sort of take you to sort of the current state, and everybody wants to hear about agents and agentic AI. So look, there we had one human, right, that had access to a credential that was unmanaged, unmonitored, and caused a huge production incident. Now, we have AI, we have agents, we have shadow AI, we have vibe coding, we have agentic AI. Agents will now get access to things that you never ever intended they would have access to. They'll take paths that you never planned because they're autonomous and can just decide what they need to do to get to their end goal. And clearly the blast radius potentially is a lot bigger because these agents can now reach out and sort of figure out what's out there in the environment. And if you've got a place with hard-coded credentials, et cetera, clearly these agents can cause huge amounts of damage, right? So look, the threat has not disappeared. I think it's now significantly more amplified. You've got a co-pilot that can now explore across your environment. I'm now going to take you through a personal story of mine as I was working on some stuff in my organization. We were doing some huge engineering work, building some big database enhancements. And naturally, I'm sure many of you have used Claude or other vibe coding tools, and I needed to change the design of a particular database table. I didn't like the enumerations that we had created, and I wanted to kind of rationalize them to something a little bit more meaningful and more scalable longer term. So I said to Claude, look, I want to refactor my database. We had 3 different enumerations. 2 of them I wanted to rename to different values. Claude said, of course, I can do that for you. Here's the SQL, run it, and job done. So I take this SQL, and I have to admit, I should have known better. I probably should have thought about the SQL that it shared to me to run, but I just ran it. Next thing I know, nearly 60% of my data is wiped, right? Why? Because the enumerations that had data associated with them, they were effectively dropped and then renamed to new enumerations. So effectively when you do that, all your existing data against those 2 enumerations gets wiped out. So I said to Claude, look what you've done. Well, look, it wasn't Claude, right? It was obviously me asking Claude to do this. And I said, look, you just wiped out my data. So what do you think Claude said? Yes, you're right. I should have known the better. It's like talking to a kid, right? I'm sure many of you have had this type of situation as you deal with Claude. So I said, look, well, let's now fix it, right? Luckily, I had a backup. I was able to recover. So I again had attempt 2, right? It tries to do it again, and it fails, right? And I said, look, why didn't you do it right this time? I told you need to do it properly. And it's, again, confident that it thought it could then fix it. And then finally I had to tell it. I said, look, no, you can't do what you're thinking, right? You need to first add the extra 2 enumerations to the 3 that you've already got. Once you've got the 5, then you can update the records, move them to the new enumeration values, and then remove the old enumerations, right? So clearly, again, we're seeing with these vibe coding tools, you're trusting them, you think they know what they're doing. Luckily for me, I was in kind of more of a staging environment, more of a development environment. I still had a backup, so I could recover. But if I was doing that in my production system, that would have obviously caused a lot of impact to us personally. A lot of our users may not have been able to access our site. We're then going to talk about something that's occurred recently. You may have heard of the Pocket OS incident where an agent blew away the database in 9 seconds for a particular organization. This organization dealt with sort of car rental reservations. They were trying to do some maintenance work. Obviously, Claude cursor. They were trying to do something again in the staging environment, and the agent kind of had some issues with the credential mismatches. It was able to find some additional credentials within the environment, and then decided, it found an API key, and then decided to run a volume delete command, and basically wiped out the whole database and all the volume backups within that organization. Caused a huge impact to this particular organization. Took them many, many days to recover because unfortunately they didn't have any backups. People couldn't make car reservations, hire out their cars. And again, another major impact. So look, what are we, and then you can read the quote on the right from the agent as they started talking to it and said, look, what have you done? Clearly, the intent was just to do some maintenance, but it decided to get a key and just blow away the database, right? So again, what the intent was, even my intent to change some enumerations, what the final end result was completely different. And as you start talking back to the agent and saying, look what's happened, it then acknowledges, and it basically broke every single rule that was told again, for it to not delete data and various other things. So look, hopefully you start to get the joke now, right? That as we move into kind of the agentic world, look, I think things now get a lot more scarier than what we were dealing with before. Yes, you could have had a human, right, that maybe did something inappropriately, maybe, by accident or maybe by design. But now we've got, like these, what I would call kids that we're now putting into our environments, right, that are just playing around, running around, just, causing havoc and just chaos, just in the way they're designed. They're there to please, they think they know what they're doing, and they try to get to the end target, but sometimes what they do to get there can cause kind of catastrophic consequences. Okay, so look, what are the key takeaways from, what I've shared with those three, real examples, two that I went through and one publicly that's out there? Look, in all the cases, the intent was clear, right? Someone trying to update a database in UAT connects to production, enumerations corrupt our data, and then some maintenance causes, your whole database to be wiped out. You hear a lot, probably through the whole week, about, intent and context, but at the heart of everything is access, identity. Those are the foundations. And clearly, the example I shared first, with all the issues that we had with NHIs, if you've not got your estate under control and you then unleash these agents, they can then discover other credentials to figure out a path to get to the end point. There was in the previous session where, again, some IM leader was using Claude and it kind of escalated their privileges. So what I would say first is make sure your foundations are solid from an NHI kind of control standpoint, that if you're building your agentic infrastructure off a weak foundation, it's a recipe for disaster. Clearly, it's all about access. It's all about moving not from kind of static access, to moving to more runtime-based kind of authorization, where you need to look at what the agent's doing at that time and is what they're doing appropriate? Like, can they delete a whole database or a volume? But if you've just given them carte blanche access, or it's found an API key that's got full access, full admin access to a database, clearly it can then do real damage. Obviously, if humans are using agents, they typically then, the agents inherit your blast radius, and that's really dangerous. And there's been a lot of talk all week about, the agent should have its own identity, it should have its own permissions, again, based on what it needs. If you just pass through the permissions, that the human has, and through the chain, that's very, very dangerous. Look, I think many of you that have used Claude and others, and you've defined your kind of prompts, or your guidelines, your instructions, I'm sure everyone's seen whatever you tell your agents to do, your vibe coding tools, these are the 5 rules you must follow. They never follow them, right? Again, it's like a kid, you tell them to do something, but they just ignore it, right? So look, system prompts are not security controls. You need to have proper, guardrails and boundaries that live outside the core, agents and the models. And I think, you can probably see the theme now. Look, the most dangerous insider is one that I don't think is going to be conscious anymore. At least with humans, there's some integrity, there's some policies, there's some standards, there's some expectations that you comply with the rules within your organization. I think with agents, there are no rules, right? So the damage can be real. So look, in closing, what does this mean? If you're a security leader, you clearly are going to have agents that are out there, shadow IT, shadow AI agents. You clearly need to understand what's out there, inventory them, understand what kind of exposure those agents could have within your organization. I would say, look, whatever insider threat models your organizations have got at the moment, they're totally obsolete, right? They now need to be based on intent. So I would definitely advise you to really think about, when you think about internal threats now, I think the threat levels have now gone to like code red levels, and you really need to think about, things very differently now from a threat standpoint. Look, I think the examples I've just shared are just the tip of the iceberg. I think we're going to end up seeing hundreds, thousands of these kind of incidents, accidents, mistakes, people playing around with the tools, even within development environments, and these mistakes occurring. So look, from a practitioner standpoint, our view is, look, every agent is a non-human identity. It needs to be properly governed, managed. You need to make sure you've got the appropriate controls as you start to build out your agentic infrastructure. The heart is obviously, identity, but then you need to look at more strategic things as you kind of mature around real-time authorization, taking into account intent, context. Clearly, you need to have kill switches, human in the loop if things go horribly wrong. Clearly, you need to be able to audit your agents, because if you can't, if you don't know what you've got, you can't govern. So I think that's kind of the end of my short kind of talk. It was really just to share with you my views that the internal threat is much bigger than the external threat. And with that, I'll close and see if there's any questions anyone has.